So, hello again. Yes, welcome. And as we were just discussing there briefly before I hit record, this is a session with a bit of a difference to some of the others I've offered in the past, in that I am going to talk for a bit and share a few slides. I am also going to invite you to ask any questions or share any thoughts that come up in response. But in between that, I'm going to invite us all to reflect together on some of these questions that arise from what I'll be sharing. So if you're watching this later, there'll be a pause at which point you can do that, for yourself, perhaps writing some things down. But I encourage everybody, as I'm speaking now at the beginning, to make some notes, see what's coming up for you, both for your own reflection, but also perhaps for a smaller group discussion as we proceed. So the title of the talk, what does it mean to be free? You can interpret that in so many different ways. I mean, obviously, the framework here that I'm going to be exploring is largely related to yoga, and that's the real sort of focus of the evening. But what does it mean to be a yoga practitioner in 2024 living in the world? That's the more interesting question than perhaps what it says in obscure old texts that we might reach for looking for some guidance, but perhaps don't actually embody to the letter. So part of our challenge in the modern world, engaging with old ideas, is to find how we build a bridge between the two things. And that's really what it is I want to drill down into this evening, inviting us all to reflect a little bit on what a word like freedom actually means to us in modern life, because it might have a very different flavor to some of what I'm about to talk about. And the other thing I want to underline is that it's not always easy to make progress with these sorts of questions by oneself, and that's part of the aim of coming together to have a chat in this way, because more heads are better than one in that respect. From the point of view of the ultimate goals of yoga, perhaps it's about turning inwards and switching off some of the chatter in the mind, but to get a bit clearer about what we're doing and why. That is something that really does benefit from analytical thinking, critical thinking, shared discussions that enable us to reflect on new ways of seeing things that might not instinctively have occurred to us by ourselves. So that's the sort of backdrop to why I like to do this sort of thing. And the backdrop to that backdrop is that I'm hosting a course that starts next month called The Path of Knowledge, which incorporates some of this methodology into how we get together and discuss some of what I'll be presenting. So I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the session for those who are interested, and share a special discount code if you're tempted to hang around for that. But now I'm going to put some slides on the screen and get going. If there are any questions at any time, though, do feel free to type them in the chat, or I will pause at the end and take any questions before we get into discussion. Do please feel free to pose those at any moment. Right, here we go. So what does it mean to be free? Well, in the traditional yogic sense, this is going right back to the foundations of the worldview that yoga arose to address. And that worldview was all about a cycle. And the nature of that cycle was not necessarily pleasant. The problem really was that life continued from one lifetime to the next. And this was sustained by the way we act. This is the foundational sort of worldview of all ancient Indian philosophy, the doctrine of karma and rebirth, creating a cycle known as samsara, transmigration from one lifetime to the next, all affected by how one acts. And therefore, it's suggested here in this quote from the oldest of the Upanishads that everything comes down to desire, because what we want affects what we then do to try and fulfill our desires, which has an impact on the mind, which conditions us towards the next action. Basically, more of the same if we like it, try to avoid it if we don't, is the simplest version of that. Therefore, everything is conditioned by this desire. And the earliest statements of what it would mean to be freed from the cycle of suffering, the cycle of births, and this problematic samsaric existence, all boil down to this word desire. Somebody who does not desire, who has transcended desires, basically, who has no desire other than to be completely removed from the problem of desire, that is the person who is liberated. Unless you can get yourself into that sort of way of being, way of seeing, then there won't be freedom from the cycle. And so all early teachings on yoga are in one way or another talking about how to stop that spinning wheel. And so we can get off. And the simplest way to do that, really, if the problem is wanting things and then doing things to try and fulfill those desires, the simplest answer is to do as this guy is doing in the picture. Sit down, don't do anything. Basically, turn your attention inwards in deep meditation, become completely detached from the world outside. And the earliest definitions of yoga talk about restraining the senses and turning them inwards. And so here is an example from the Mahabharata about 2000 years ago, describing how if you really do that and go all the way with it, you've basically got no involvement with the outside world through the senses, and therefore there is no desire. There really is no person left upstairs. There is basically an inanimate object, like a piece of wood. He does not desire anything. So liberation is often described in those terms, resolving this problem of wanting, freedom then from the suffering caused by constantly striving for satisfaction. But that's that's a hardcore path, and not so many of us called to go and sit in the forest until we become emaciated and on the verge of disappearing, eating only air, as other passages of the Mahabharata describe it. So, we need to perhaps look at other ways in which yoga is presented, I think, to have a broader understanding of how freedom becomes interpreted. One way or another, it's liberation from this problem. And one way or another, it has to show that it achieves that kind of result. So fast forwarding now 1500 years to the Hatha Pradipika, the best known compilation on physical yoga practice from the medieval era. And it's basically saying the same thing. If you're actually liberated, you look like you're dead. And somebody who is that absorbed in deep meditation has no sensory involvement with anything else, nor even an awareness of being a person, never mind of anybody else. So that's the sort of gold standard proof that the mind is transcended, the problem is solved. But this is coming from a tradition of physical yoga practice involving using the body, no longer necessarily spending life in a cave. And there are many other medieval Hatha yoga texts that describe liberation a little bit differently. This is perhaps just a sort of distilling of the problem to eradicate it at its source, after which different approaches can be taken. And there's a couple of examples here from early Hatha yoga texts. Really describing almost the opposite. Basically liberated in the body, so not liberated from the body like those descriptions sounded, but instead empowered to be fully here forever, basically attaining immortality. There's a very famous old text about yoga by an academic, a Romanian guy, Mircea Eliade, perhaps the first sort of mainstream analysis of yogic ideas for a Western audience, put together in a very sort of scholarly way. And his title was Immortality and Freedom. So the nature of freedom in the physical yoga practice sense perhaps is to live forever, is the way it's described. Here's the Amrita Siddhi, the first text about 1,000 years ago to teach some of the techniques that other physical yoga texts then borrow. Says, once you're liberated from this spinning cycle, you don't have to disappear and emaciate yourself in a cave. Instead, you can live for hundreds and thousands of years. The only condition is you do have to hide away. And that's why none of us have met, presumably anybody from the 11th century. The other text here, the Amaralga, is very early adaptation of the same teachings as the Amrita Siddhi into what we would now call Shaiva traditions. So basically, the Amrita Siddhi comes from a Buddhist background, the Amaralga, and its later extended version called the Amaralga Prabodha, what we might call today Hindu. And exactly the same story. You're empowered, you can live like a god, you can do whatever you like. that might involve living like an ascetic, being naked in a cave, or it might mean dressing up in all of your finery. You can sleep with all the celestial beings, or you can be celibate. You can live off whatever anybody puts in your begging bowl, or you can do anything you please. So there really is this sense of, absolute empowerment through physical practice, even though, in some ways it does still prove it works by shutting everything down. You've got mastery over the mind-body system. And so I think the sort of missing link in understanding all of that is the philosophies of Tantra, which influence how physical yoga develops. And they resolve a conundrum that most early yoga texts leave you sort of having to decide between. As it's put towards the end of the Magic Powers chapter of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, the Vibhuti Pada, basically, you've either got to renounce all that, kind of supernatural capability if you want to be free, or if you want to enjoy all that stuff, you're not going to get liberated. So it was effectively a choice between liberation and empowerment, not just of the body, but of the mind. And ultimately the power to transcend death. That's the offer. What that means, of course, is perhaps open to question whether the body really lives forever, or whether concern for the body is somehow removed, so that the fact that it falls to pieces is of no great consequence. Patanjali himself might agree that that was an acceptable sort of way to become immortal, but he's still very much into the idea that you've got to give up all of this doing stuff in the world mentality if you want to be liberated. So the absolute liberation for Patanjali, Kaivalya, coming from Kevala, meaning alone or separate, is really about withdrawal and the separation of this pure state of presence, witnessing consciousness from everything else, the mind, the body, the senses, the world. So yes, you get freed, but you're back to the ascetic realm of the bubble. A lot of subsequent teachings borrow from the tantric idea that you don't have to choose, that in fact, through empowerment, you attain the ability to liberate yourself through using the body rather than avoiding the body, avoiding its desires. You get liberated. So there's something subtler going on. And I think that helps us to think a bit more subtly about what freedom means. So a few final thoughts on that before we open it up for a chat. Really, for Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra, the problem is in the mind, and it's the way we relate to the world. First of all, misidentification with this mind and body, and it says there, taking that which is eternal for that which is constantly changing and temporary and eventually going to fall to pieces. So the body is not the true self, and getting misidentified with not just the body, but the contents of the mind, particularly the part of the mind that personalizes everything and says, I want, that's the problem. So this is the classical idea of wanting is the source of the problem. Desire and aversion, it's two sort of manifestations, craving for the stuff we like and desire to avoid the things that we don't. Ultimately, the number one craving and number one aversion, fear of death and the desire to transcend it. So a lot of early yoga rejects those sorts of ideas of potentially somehow embodying a solution. The solution in the end is disembodiment for Patanjali. But there's also there the seed of the idea that if you see differently, perhaps you don't need to go all the way with that. If you get rid of this problem of desire, then there's no reason to stop being part of the world. And the problem of desire isn't necessarily having it. It's what we do with it. So to understand some of that a bit more subtly, we can turn to the commentary on the Yoga Sutra, which starts to analyze how things work in terms of the gunas. And the three gunas, rajas, tamas, and sattva, are really fundamental to its analysis of things. They are the building blocks of Sankhya philosophy, which was very popular in early yoga texts and is now not so well known. Firstly, it talks about duality. Secondly, it often leads to this world-renouncing perspective. But thirdly, I think perhaps because it's not so well understood. These tools help us to think about refining relationships with reality. And it's saying that effectively the problem, and it's complicated commentarial Sanskrit here, translated by Jim Mallinson and Mark Singleton in Roots of Yoga. But bottom line is the mind is sometimes dominated by agitation, rajas, this activating tendency. And that can actually be a good thing because it can sometimes cut through the even more enveloping problem of tamas, which is heavy and dark and connected with ignorance in a lot of descriptions. And therefore, the cultivation of a judicious amount of rajas can penetrate that problem and reveal inner clarity. But ultimately, both rajas and tamas are on the one hand, unhelpful because they keep the mind distracted and stop this pure clarity from emerging, which is ultimately what enables you to rest forever in your own sense of being this pure self. But perhaps they're also beneficial because a judicious use of each of those two opposites, rajas and tamas, helps to offset the problem of the other. So that's where the realm of yoga practice is active. And that starts to say, hang on a minute, maybe if we're not going all the way with this giving up desire thing, we can get more skillful in our relationship with desire. And that's certainly how tantric texts start to talk about things. And perhaps also in the general yogic milieu, even before Patanjali was talking. The sort of freedom described in the Bhagavad Gita at times is very much of that nature. And there's a rather cheesy Euro pop song here from the 90s. And my teenage years have been revisited recently quite a bit in my Instagram postings. So I apologize for a few bars of this, just to get us in the mood. I never realized as a teenager that I would be, playing that in a slideshow and talking about yoga philosophy. But the chorus, the refrain, talks about the nature of being freed from desire is that the mind and the senses are purified. So there's actually no problem if that clarity changes the way one relates to arising desire. So one can be free in the body, in the world, the Bhagavad Gita says, so long as one has the capacity to deal with the agitation that comes from desire and anger, this sort of pushing away some things and pulling other things nearer. That's what it means to be yogic. That's what it means to be happy. That's what it means to be active. Bhagavad Gita very famously not talking about renouncing the world, instead how to be embodied, engaged in very full relationship with the rest of the world. So using some of those ideas a little bit more subtly, perhaps even getting into the realm of sporting in God's playground. If you take a theistic view of what the Gita is talking about, which is certainly what it invites us to do. And then there's a whole realm of devotional religion influencing yoga, which talks about that very possibility that shifting our perspective on life makes everything blissful and wonderful because it is divine, including us. So there is another way of looking at freedom there, freedom to let go of the past. The Bhagavad Gita ends with Krishna saying to Arjuna, give up all those practices. You don't have to do anything. Just throw yourself at my feet and I will liberate you. So there's all sorts of spins on what liberation means in traditional texts. But I think we still need to question, where does that take us? And that is where I want to go next, really, is to open this up and start to think about how we understand liberation. Do we think about freedom from the world, like some of those early analyses? Do we think more about freedom to do things, like some of those Hatha Yoga immortality descriptions? Do we perhaps think a bit more like the Bhagavad Gita about freedom in the world? Or are we starting to think much more by other things that have conditioned us in the various decades that we've been alive, such as freedom of, say, speech, assembly, other such rights that we enjoy as citizens, in theory at least. And then there's another spin on the whole thing, which is perhaps to say that, a bit like the Bhagavad Gita, perhaps the greatest freedom is to have less choice, more responsibility. Give yourself over to that. You're freed from the problem of, staring at the supermarket shelves, trying to differentiate 25 versions of breakfast cereal. So there are many ways in which we can take this conversation. What does it mean to be free? And I'd like to open it up to see what we all think. Before we split into some smaller groups and have a little chat amongst ourselves, though, I'd like to ask if there are any pressing questions in response to what I've said so far. Anything that was unclear or anything that you'd like to respond to? All questions welcome. Please just feel free to either unmute and speak out. Yeah, Georgie.
Hello, Daniel. I have a question. I will write on.
You'll type that one. Okay. Yeah. So here we come. Understand that Patanjali describes two types of yoga: Kriya yoga for those with worldly concerns and wandering minds, and Ashtanga yoga for those who are seeking renunciation. Do you believe that Patanjali's teachings also encompass worldly engagement, or were they primarily intended for those pursuing renunciation? It's definitely true. At the start of the second chapter, the Kriya Yoga is introduced with this commentarial preface that says, the previous chapter was all the advanced stuff for people who can steady their minds and get involved in deep meditation. For those who can't even do that, here is something else to do. And these three components of Kriya Yoga, Tapas, Svadhyaya, Ishvara, Pranidhana, very much related, I think, to worldly activity. Kriya Yoga is similar to Karma Yoga in the Gita. Kriya, karma, coming from the same verbal root, kr, meaning to do, therefore to act. But I think Patanjali is presenting that as preliminary training and not suggesting that that is in itself a path, because it doesn't really get mentioned again. And there are repeated references in the Ashtanga Yoga description of yama and niyama, starting at that level of some very world-renouncing perspectives. First of all, the vow of celibacy. Second of all, the fruit of cleanliness being disgust for the body and the desire to avoid contact with other bodies, and the commentary explaining you become an ascetic and you're ready to give up your body. So I think Patanjali's main message was related to that. It's about world renunciation. Those ideas can be interpreted in much more worldly ways, so long as some of them are kind of reinterpreted. But to do that would be to add something, I think, and also to change something. And it's fine for us to do that, but we would need to say that's what we were doing rather than suggesting that's what Patanjali meant in the first place. Because I think it's pretty clear, certainly from the traditional commentarial perspective, that world renunciation was where he was going. Anything else before we dive in? Sandy, yes. You're unmuted? No, you're still on mute. Let's see. Can we get you off mute?
There we go.
Yes, there we go.
Having trouble finding it. Do you think it's important that we establish for ourselves where we fall on duality, non-duality, or non-duality with distinctions before we figure out where we fall with liberation?
It's a very good question. It's a bit chicken and egg in the end, really, because the flavor of liberation on offer is determined by the type of philosophy one is guided by. But liberation is a long way off. And in some ways, what matters is taking steps towards it. So one has to almost pick a path to be able to walk it. But at the same time, what's at the end of the path is kind of academic in a way. A friend of mine shared a very helpful metaphor for this, suggesting that talk about liberation is butterfly language, and most of us are caterpillars taking our first steps along a leaf. Sure, one day we might get in a cocoon and become a butterfly, but asking questions about the nature of butterflyness is less relevant than what we do as caterpillars. And yet, at the same time, which perspective we adopt is going to shape the way that we act. So I do think it is important to ask ourselves which worldview speaks to us, and then that will help us see where to study, see which texts are most relevant. But I honestly think the most important thing, first of all, is to ask ourselves, why the hell are we interested in this stuff in the first place? And what is it we want to get out of it? And that's really what I'm getting at with the big picture question of what does it mean to be free? For a lot of people, the honest answer, if you were go into the average yoga studio, it would be, find a bit more peace and quiet from my very hectic and stressful life, or to find a bit more ease of movement in my own comfortable body, or to deal with this injury that's causing me pain. And those are very long-standing now types of freedom associated with the teaching of postural yoga since at least the early 20th century in India, and now obviously globalized. So I think it helps to be, clear about that for ourselves. If all we're really looking for is to feel better in a body, that's got a long pedigree in and of itself. And it's probably helpful to be clear about that. And that might only be a provisional answer. It might be good for 5 years, and then suddenly there's a curiosity about something else, especially when we realize feeling good in this body ain't going to last. It's not imperative, is all I really want to say, to be interested in the ultimate goals of yoga. But if one is curious, then yes, you're right. I think it does help to pick a path, because it helps then to see where to study.
Thanks.
Okay. How about we have a little chat in smaller groups for a bit? I think it could be fun just to sort of brainstorm and see what comes up. And as I emphasized at the beginning, this is not compulsory, but if you're here and you showed up to hear ideas, it could be a lot of fun to exchange them with one another. So I'm going to create some breakout rooms with roughly 3 people in each. Going to give you just 10 minutes. And as I was emphasizing at the beginning, you're not going to be recorded. I won't even hear you. You're free to say what you like. If you just want to pass and the others in your room are quite happy to chat and let you listen, that's cool. If you want to come back in here in the main room, I will be around. I will pause the recording though. So that's not, as I say, essential. And if you really want to log out and log back in 10 minutes, you're welcome to do that too. For now though, I'm going to make some breakout rooms and invite you to join them. Let's see. If we go this way, then we'll have groups of 3, I think. And I shall invite you back here in 10 minutes to ask you, what does it mean to be free? What does it mean to you? So hopefully you've got an invitation. If you just click that, you'll have the chance to chat to some relative strangers, or maybe some people you've met before if you're lucky. And anyone who's still staying here with me, I shall press pause on the recording and start it. Just quickly for those tuning in later to watch this, I invite you to take a few moments, press pause, and just jot down to yourself, an honest response. What does it mean to me to be free? That can have 2 or 3 different flavors. What is it that I'm looking for from yoga practice? What does freedom mean to me in my life here and now? Perhaps also, how do the two relate to each other? What does freedom that one accesses through perhaps a physical yoga practice, which is the predominant form that many are engaged in today, how does that relate to what I want to then do in the rest of my life? So just take a few moments to let that bubble away, and then maybe restart in a few minutes. Okay, welcome back to those who've rejoined. There will be an influx in the next few seconds of everybody else, and then we'll share some thoughts together. So thank you to everyone who engaged and dived in and was up for a bit of a chat. I'm excited to hear about what was discussed. Hopefully some difference of opinion maybe arose, and there was a bit of a debate, or perhaps you all agreed, which would also be interesting to hear about. But I suspect probably more potential for a variety of perspectives than for everybody to have the same one, unless we all just say, I want to get moksha. Anyone feel like sharing anything that came up in their group? You're welcome to type in the chat if you would prefer not to speak out loud. But please do feel, you're very welcome to say whatever's on your mind. And it will be fun to hear a range of perspectives. So just unmute and speak if you feel comfortable doing that, or if you prefer to wave your hand, whether with Zoom's raise hand function or just holding it up, go for it.
Danielle, this is Sandy. I'm just talking because I'm doing it on my phone and it's
No
very hard to
worries,
find my unmute.
That's good.
I think we had a lovely discussion, and I think there were a lot of bridges between ideas, and it was just very nice. So it was the input of, the asana, the body posture, the chanting, and the meditation, and to me, it just everybody kind of folded in on their thoughts, and I thought it was just very nice.
Well, great. No, thank you. I think it's very affirming to hear that, because I know myself that I often have felt in my yoga life that there are too few places to come together and just feel that we've got peers who we can talk to about very simple matters related to theory and practice. Obviously, one can do that in the yoga studio, and usually by the shoes is the one place where talking does happen. I've very rarely encountered places that put on their weekly timetable, chat, let's come together and talk and and see what we feel about things. So I think it's nice sometimes just to hear how there are these connections that can be made by sharing ideas. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, Georgie.
Thank you. My next question is, Daniel, what do you think about do yogis truly believe in mystical powers, or is this belief partially symbolic or metaphoric? Personally, it's hard to believe that we are believing all this. And is this also related with yoga philosophy? What do you think about this? Thank you.
It's a very good question, yeah, and I don't think it's necessarily an either or question, in that powers have to either be literally real or fully imaginary. I think actually there is a bridge between those two in the philosophical realm. And it's clearest in Patanjali's text because of its foundation in Sankhya philosophy. And the idea of Sankhya philosophy, very simply, is the distinction between Purusha and Prakriti. So Prakriti is everything material, including the body and the mind and the senses and the world with which we engage. And Purusha is just pure consciousness. And in order to understand that distinction, one really has to understand the subtlest parts of the material realm, which are in the mind, and to have mastery over them. And in theory, the way that Sankhya explains how the world comes into being is it starts from unmanifest formlessness, and through the workings of the gunas slowly evolves into the subtlest things first, and eventually into the elements that make up objects. And so if you are to somehow rewind all of that back up into formlessness, put it to one side, have no further interest in it, and instead be focused on pure presence, then you have to have mastery over the material world. That's the sort of theoretical framework for it. So in that sense, you could have a metaphor that talked about all of these things in order to show your capacity to be it's all introduced in a chapter that really talks about the technique being samyama, which is deep concentration on specific objects that lead to these particular results. The idea being almost that you're just working through the material realm in increasing subtlety, trying to show the capacity to somehow harness that in the project of seeing beyond it. And then it sort of comes up with this framework of, well, you can get lost in that and magic things might happen. And I think, all of us, if we're honest, have got some experience of things that we might not have imagined if we practiced some form of yoga meditation for a sustained period, things that we would not have imagined being possible. I'm not trying to suggest that means, yes, there are yogis out there who can fly or time travel or whatever it might be. I don't know. I've never met any. But I do know that the sort of limits to what's possible are not always what we imagine. Sometimes even by imagining them, we create them. And part of the idea about yoga is to remove the limitations to just this transcendent awareness. And so again, even if it is metaphorical, that might unlock all sorts of capacities. The subtle sensitivity of awareness that is developed through practice might be analogous to some of these magic powers. It might not literally mean that you can read other people's minds, but you might become very sensitive to what's happening and be pretty accurate in your guesses as to what's going on, and even have premonitions. So on that level, I think again it gets into the grey area of not one or the other. But literally speaking, I wouldn't say I've been through all of those 40-something list of things that are supposed to develop and found people who are physically doing them in front of me. And in fact, the defense that's often there in yoga texts is that the yogi should gain these powers. They're proof of progress on the path, but he shouldn't show them to anybody. Otherwise, that undermines all the progress. So that's a great, get out clause, never having to prove that they exist.
Thank you.
Welcome. Any other thoughts about freedom in general? What came up in your discussions, ways in which you might relate that concept to yoga, even if it's not about the highest realms or the capacity to levitate?
Hello, can I speak?
Yes, Alison, please.
Hi.
Yes.
Thank you. I was with Anuj and Sonia, and I think what was interesting for us, I think we were all kind of groping towards this idea that our idea of freedom was very much embodied, freedom to live well. Our talk kind of took a sort of moral dimension. So rather than being like a methodology to liberate oneself in whatever way you want to go with that, I think we shared a perspective of we somehow create our world, the values of our world. We talked a bit about perspective, Pratipatchabhav, all those kind of things that you can go off and like talk about forever. But it was all very much, I think they'll agree with me, coming from an idea of freedom to live well. And if I have the freedom to live well, then hopefully my fellow beings live well. There is a sense of a shared being in the world and freedom. That's not too. I hope I have misrepresented them there, though.
That is a really important point. A lot of early yoga texts, and in fact, most sort of advanced yoga practice descriptions are all about the individual practitioner and effectively about the transcendence of the world. They're not very focused on the benefit of the greater good of society or the multitude of people in it. The Bhagavad Gita is really the only text that goes in that direction in a wholehearted way, and it does that for all sorts of strange historical reasons, because it's really talking about dharma rather than yoga. It's talking about responsibility in the world, and yoga is part of that picture, and yoga is a tool that is offered as a way to fulfill dharma, both in terms of responsibility and virtuous action. And for that reason, it's actually a very relevant text, I think, to the modern world, because it is talking our language in the ways you describe. And Buddhist traditions, which I think have quite an influence on the Gita, are also, because of their philosophy, to come back to Sandy's earlier question, not really offering the same get out as some of the yogic traditions that talk about this true self that is transcendent and timeless, and you can go to this realm that lasts forever. The Buddha says everything's impermanent and there is no permanent self, and therefore all you can do is understand how everything is interconnected and start creating conditions for less suffering. And as the tradition expands, talking about for all beings, not just for the practitioner himself. So I think those are really interesting questions, and values and purpose have got a lot more to do with the way that anyone who lives in the world needs to think about, my freedom might come at somebody else's expense. How do I draw the line and respect, my right to maximize my potential without treading on their potential too? I mean, that's where a lot of political disagreements and conflicts come in. And sometimes there are two things that are both right and yet can't be harmonized, and then that gets very complicated. And no rainbows and unicorns platitudes are going to make it go away. It's the messy business of life in the world. But if we're using this sort of practice and philosophy to try and help us be as skillful as we can be in that messy business, then I think we've really talked about what for most of us actually is happening with this whole endeavor as householders in the 21st century. So thanks, great point. Any other reflections on that theme, or completely different one, or any other questions arising? Yes, Raphael.
All right. Okay. Hi.
Hey.
Well, first of all, talking with Trine about freedom, I noticed it's a very abstract concept, and it's like there is no way for me to really formulate what freedom really means to me. It's like solving a Rubik's cube that is like where something is switched, where the cubes are switched, so you cannot really solve it. And you think you solve it, and then you notice, oh, this is not working again either. And I mean, so when I'm facing kind of like an abstract problem that is actually regarding my life, then I try to reduce it to practical questions. So I would say, in terms of freedom, I notice some things seem to help me, like, if I don't know how to put it. Like, the thing is, actually, for me, freedom and happiness is almost synonymous. And some
Interesting.
and some actions seem to increase my perceived freedom, happiness, and others don't. And then I try to notice that and do more of that which is beneficial to my freedom, perceived freedom and happiness. Like, for example, when I buy something expensive, I notice it's actually going to just increase a craving for buying something again afterwards. So that's not going to be beneficial to my freedom. When I do yoga, as in terms of asanas, I notice the stretching is good for my body. So just the feeling of feeling more healthy gives me a feeling of freedom. When I sit down to meditate, this is anyway this is the utmost, the highest level of freedom I can actually perceive. So I do more of it. I just like to meditate because it makes me happy and more free. So this is my point. Is it's so abstract, so difficult to come to kind of like give a technical description of what is freedom, that I just try to think to go in myself and just think, okay, what does it mean to me practically? What can I do about it? Yeah. But of course, I'm not wise, and I'm probably going to do things where in 10 years I would think like, this was not like increasing my freedom. I was just delusional. So it's a learning process.
Oh, thank you. It's very honest, and I think it reveals two things in a way. One, the potential, as you say, to trip ourselves up, because trying to maximize happiness and freedom is fulfilling our own desires, which has always been suggested to be the root of the problem. And yet, at the same time, you showed actually quite clearly how paying really close attention shows that a lot of the time what we think we want is not actually what we need. And if we can get subtler about paying attention to what that feels like, whether there is just an increased agitation, a worry about losing all the stuff that we've got, or feeling less secure, the more we try to get security, and perhaps perversely feeling freer, the less worried we are about whether or not we lose whatever we think we have. Then there's a different way of relating to things, and I think the connecting thread for me is that yoga is always talking about a way of seeing beyond the mind. That's the sort of bottom line algorithm of a lot of yogic teachings. There's a different way of perceiving that's beyond verbalization. And actually, what you were then describing is the essence of that. We have to feel our way towards something, and sometimes talking about it like this can be very helpful to just sort of clarify, clean out the cobwebs, and tune back in. But in the end, it's not something that is verbalized as a modality, the way to find more freedom within ourselves, because it's really about the heart, it's not the mind. And in the sense of the heart, I don't mean literally the physical heart, but these heart qualities of increasing openness and receptivity, and the sensing that comes from that. So cultivating those capacities, they can only really be felt into. And then they can be applied in everyday circumstances. That's what makes people nice to be around if they appear to be sensitive to us and relating to us also, and perhaps even using it to be very skillful in saying what needs to be said. Some people can be very effective even as politicians and have a bit more open-heartedness. And I wouldn't want to stretch that analogy too far, but just to say you can get very worldly and still have some of this going along. But it's very easy once you're into that realm to be completely taken over by ideas and it should be this way. And actually that just creates the problem. And so sometimes thinking about freedom can be more of a problem than a solution, because it starts to get us very focused on me, desires, and it doesn't actually bring us back to the simplest idea of contentment. The ultimate freedom that's, again, very common in yogic text is to not need anything, to be happy with everything just as it is, to be able to accept the world just as it is, including ourselves. And that doesn't mean, obviously, we give up doing anything and trying to get food or stop having a roof over our heads. But the general orientation of that is to understand that satisfaction is something created by the way we relate to reality, not by the stuff that we get out there. And so that, again, is something that has to be sensed into, I think. And so, greater freedom comes from being good at that. And I notice I've been a lot happier in my life when I was less concerned with a lot of, worldly accumulation. And the more focused I've got on goals, the more miserable I tend to get, even when I achieve them. And yet I need goals, otherwise I get lost in my life. So it's the skillful use of these things rather than being controlled by them is where the sweet spot is, I think. But that's just my opinion. You may disagree. Please feel free to. Yes, Georgie. Yes.
I have one more question. It's a question about freedom. As I understand from Bhagavad Gita, there is in European philosophy, there is also concept of freedom, which is close tied to duty and responsibility. They also understand freedom is based on our duty, and it's quite similar as say in Gita understand that you should follow your dharma. However, there is differences that this dharma of Arjuna comes from caste system.
Yes.
It is not his free choice. He like his passion or his free will. And what do you think about this comparison and these two different understandings of freedom?
It's a very good point to raise that, because we were talking a little bit about some of the drawbacks of the Yoga Sutra. It's quite world renouncing, quite ascetic in its orientation. The Bhagavad Gita has one of those drawbacks in there, the relationship to hierarchical structure of society and the fact that you should do the duty that you're born into, basically, and not anybody else's. And in fact, if you do your duty with devotion, everybody can be liberated, including the lowest castes, including, it says, even women, which is not something that yoga texts talk about very much, and that's quite a jarring thing to read in itself. But I think there are lots of things that make the Gita problematic. It's set in a war zone. God tells Arjuna to kill, and basically, in the broader story of the Mahabharata, the good guys win by cheating. So it's complex, and Dharma is a slippery business. It's doing the right thing for the right reasons at the right time in the right way, and it's very hard to be the right judge of that. And for me, the simplest example of this that I often come back to is Mohandas Gandhi claimed he'd built a philosophy of non-violence out of 12.5 verses at the end of chapter 2 of the Gita. And the guy who shot him dead said he was also inspired by Krishna, doing what needed to be done to preserve the well-being of the community, basically, from the perspective of Hindu nationalism. And so, it's very easy to get misled by some of the ideas in the Gita. But I think there is something that is actually very liberating about giving oneself over to responsibilities. and to finding, a lot of comfort in being of service, and to recognizing that the more we sit around trying to optimize our lives, the easier it is to get unhappy, because we get lost in comparisons with all of the other possibilities that we could have. This person earns more money, this person is more successful, this person has a better body, this person, whatever it might be. If we just put all that aside and get on with just trying to be useful, I think, we get a lot more satisfaction that way. Although obviously you can take that to an extreme as well and be exploited. And there is that problem. Some of the ideas in the Bhagavad Gita leads to, the idea that karma yoga means hanging out in the ashram, doing all the work while the guru gets rich and you don't get paid. So it's I guess like most of these things, it's finding a middle way between those two polarities. And this is really, I think, what we need to do when we're trying to bring ancient texts into modern life. We have to acknowledge that the worldview of ancient India is not the worldview of the 21st century globalized yoga community. It's going to be very different depending on our own cultural conditioning. And so the answer isn't just to rip up yoga tradition and say we don't need any of that because it's all flawed. But it's also not to pretend that we're following it to the letter while inventing a new thing and saying, oh yes, when Patanjali says asana, he means vinyasa flow. Instead, we try to be more skillful and say, these things have some basic frameworks, some principles, and we can use those to guide us with our own project of trying to keep some of these philosophies relevant to the needs of our time. And then we don't source it all back to Patanjali or the Bhagavad Gita or anywhere else. We just take responsibility for this is how I see things, and this is how I'm inspired by tradition to live a modern life. And on that note, if you'll pardon me just for a moment, I do just want to quickly mention this course that I am facilitating that will be running for a year starting next month. Just give you a very, very brief summary. Some of you are already taking part in it, but I know a couple of others are curious. I do want to just sort of emphasize that what we've just been doing really is what we're going to try and do in a much more sort of integrated, systematic way over the course of 20 modules. Basically, looking at the entire history of yoga's evolution, looking at all the main sources of yogic ideas and trying to see what inspires us, and spending a 90-minute discussion session in larger groups, in smaller groups, informed by some study of written materials, video presentations, trying to get to grips with what yoga means to us in lots of different ways, and eventually building up to some sort of project that turns that into something useful for us, whether that's a simple statement of principles. This is why I call what I do yoga, and this is how it works. Or it could be, a blueprint for a series of workshops that someone wants to teach, or it could be, inspiration to make art that says, this is how I feel yoga, and this is how I can channel it through my, sensitivities. It could be anything you like, but the idea is this is a framework for structured conversations with a root in traditional sources. And really, to sum it all up, it's a mixture of my backgrounds. I've spent time in the academic world of the last decade. I was teaching last year at a university in London, but I've also been a yoga practitioner for more than 20 years, and I'm interested in how that sort of real analytical, critical thinking can be used in a helpful way by yoga practitioners. So what I end up doing in what I present is to take the stuff you can get from a university master's course, making it more user-friendly and charging less money. And so therefore, we will get an overview of all of the latest understandings about the history and philosophy of yoga. We will drill down into how to make sense of that for ourselves. And as a result of that, you will spend a lot of time chatting to people from all over the world who've got similar interests. So the structure is, as I say, to break it down into 20 parts. The first of these is at the end of September. We'll get started in the middle of September by releasing the first module. And if you go to the website, truthofyoga.com, you can browse in great detail the contents of these modules and the dates and how it all fits together and works. But just to emphasize, we go from the beginning of it all through all of these things we've been talking about, Dharma and the Gita and the Yoga Sutra and Sankhya philosophy, the philosophies of the Upanishads and tantric traditions, Vedanta in its various forms, and eventually into the evolution of modern yoga. And the ultimate question over all of it is what's authentic? It does not have to be old to be authentic. We've already proved that the way we've been talking about texts. But for things to be authentic, we have to have a personal relationship with them that makes sense to us. And we need to be clear about what we are, I guess, adding and changing in order to make sure that timeless principles have specific contextual relevance to us in whatever we're doing. And all of that, I think, helps to deal with these concerns about cultural appropriation that are out there at the moment. And we will discuss those concerns as well as ways to address them. So the last thing I just wanted to say is if you sign up before this weekend and pay the course fee in full using this discount code, which I'll send around in an email, you will get £100 off. So a special bonus incentive to join us this week. But I saw there was a question. Yeah, it's an interesting one. Is it compulsory to attend the live sessions? Not compulsory. They will be recorded in the same way that this is being recorded. The only thing is that I will not be recording what happens in the breakout rooms. So you would miss that component and you would miss the opportunity to speak and exchange ideas. But it would be possible, and some people do plan to do this because of time zone differences, to be part of the course, to not show up for all of the live seminars, but to gain the knowledge that's being offered in the pre-recorded sessions, in the reading, in the discussion forums. You also get a couple of one-to-one sessions with me. And I'm hoping to encourage people to partner up a little bit, have a study buddy and meet at a time convenient to you once in a while just to compare notes. So you could get a lot out of the course without being part of the live sessions, but for me, that's the heart of it. So part of my motivation is to offer that space. And therefore, that's really my I guess, way of saying it's not compulsory, but I would encourage it because I think it's beneficial. And the other thought that comes up here is, how does it actually impact on yoga teaching? I think the main way that intellectual engagement with this stuff has helped me is that I'm now pretty clear about what yoga has been in its various forms. I can tell one thing from another. And most importantly, I can tell what yoga means to me and put that in words of one syllable. And that's a provisional answer. It will change all the time, but it's helped me when students ask me, where do things come from? How do they fit together? That I'm clear for myself what makes sense to me and why I speak about it the way that I do. And also that I'm able to explain there are other ways of seeing and they're equally valid. They're just not my way. And so those who are interested in how I present things have got a clearer sense of what I'm about, where it comes from, that it does have some connection to the past, which, as I was saying, is a concern in terms of authenticity, but it's not solely defined by saying, I follow this lineage, therefore I am parroting the teachings. Because I don't find that helpful myself. I find it more helpful to be inspired by ideas that you can then, I guess, embody and explain based on your own experience. And of course, that requires me to admit at the outset, I'm not enlightened. I have not reached the ultimate freedom. I am still here in a body, in a mind that causes me problems from time to time. Although I'm sincere in my practice, I could probably do more of it. And although I can see the limits to intellectual engagement, I enjoy it. So I probably do more of that than is helpful for yoga practice. And so that's another way of coming to the question. A little bit of knowledge actually can go a long way. A lot of knowledge, as this course is offering, can feel overwhelming. So part of what we're going to need to do is decide, again, at the beginning, what matters to us, what are our priorities, how do I want to get inspired here? How do I want my teaching to be affected by study? What is it I'm looking for as a teacher? So a lot of this process is about personal inquiry and then setting some clear boundaries, saying, I'm just going to watch the videos, do a bit of reading and have a chat. and that will be helpful to me because it will give me, you know, a little bit more context and an opportunity to exchange ideas. Others might say, I really want to read all of the latest research. I'm going to set aside 3 or 4 days a week, maybe not the whole day, but, you know, time on those days to really read books and read articles and, you know, get the kind of education I could get at university for a fraction of the cost. So all sorts of ways that you might engage with it. Yoga teachers go and study master's degrees, not to become academics, just to feel like, you know, they actually finally understand stuff, instead of feeling confused. That's why I did it, because I was constantly being told lots of contradictory things, and I wanted to understand how that worked. So any other thoughts, reflections, or questions before we wind down? Anything else anybody wanted to say about freedom? Whether it came up in the group conversations or whether it's something that's just sort of on your mind that arises in response to everything that's been shared. Okay, well, in which case then, I'm going to say thank you very much for coming. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. Thanks for being up for diving into a room with relative strangers and engaging in some productive inquiry. I really, really do appreciate your openness to doing that. If you do have any further questions related to the course or to anything else that we've talked about today, just reply to the email that I'll send around later with the link to recording. And I'm always happy to chat about this stuff. I am a self-confessed yoga nerd, so I'm happy to nerd out anytime and hopefully get to nerd out with a few more of you over the next year. So yeah, please do feel welcome and please do feel free to ask any questions about the course if you've got any doubts. For now though, enjoy the rest of the evening, afternoon, morning. I guess it's no longer morning probably anywhere, but I hope to see you again sometime soon. Thanks for now.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thank
See you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Nice to see
Thank
you.
you, Daniel.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.